Benjamin Franklin, founding father of the United States, printer, scientist, and writer, wrote his autobiography between 1771 and 1788. By the time of his death in 1790, he was highly revered and respected for his opinions on political and social matters, not only in America, but also abroad. Benjamin Franklin's autobiography is mostly studied closely as a business tool or a rags to riches story, the first documentation of the American dream. It is often looked at not so much as an autobiography, but a secret to success memoir that anyone can pick up and become a self-made man. However, there is an issue with the idea that the autobiography is about a self-made man. While Franklin himself states that he, quote, emerged from the poverty and obscurity in which I was born and bred to a state of affluence and some degree of reputation in the world, he did not do this by his own intention. While only mentioned in the first few pages very briefly, Benjamin Franklin's mother played a large part in her son's success in life. In many ways, her absence from the autobiography is alarming, considering most of Franklin's autobiography centers around ideals found in Republican motherhood. Republican motherhood ideology was first studied in the 1970s by Linda Kerber. This ideology set to define women's indirect political roles in the new republic, rather than granting women full political rights granted towards white voting men. This, therefore, centered around the domestic sphere. A true Republican mother was literate and self-reliant. She was to pass down to her sons the virtues and civic duty of the republic. She was also to maintain these virtues in both her husband and son so they become great citizens. This task integrated both the political and domestic spheres. However, the political purpose was masked by domestic service. Franklin begins his autobiography by discussing his mother very briefly. He first mentions her name, Abadiah Folger, and gives her some account of being prestigious by way of ancestry. Now, much is said about her character, but what is stated is in relation to his father's. Quote, my mother had likewise an excellent constitution. As quickly as Franklin begins to discuss his mother, he quickly states her death, and not much is mentioned of her after, except in quick little snippets. However, Franklin himself found her character to be so important that later in his life he placed a marble slab over her grave with the inscription to note her character towards his upbringing. The slab read, without an estate or any gainful employment, by constant labor and industry, with God's blessing, they maintained a large family comfortably and brought up 13 children and 7 grandchildren reputably. From this instance, reader, be encouraged to diligence in thy calling, and distrust not providence. She was a discreet and virtuous woman. Franklin also mentions how she suckled all 10 of her children. This could be a nod to the transatlantic controversy of the time, forcing mothers to breastfeed their own children versus hiring a wet nurse. This virtue of love of a mother caring for her own children would be directly in line with Republican motherhood teachings of a self-reliant mother for a politically independent nation. When one reads the autobiography, it is easy to miss the mother's absence. Franklin does not discuss his early childhood in much detail. He simply skims over her indirectly and centers the narrative around himself and his dealings with the printing business. However, his mother's presence is not missing from the narrative entirely. Instead, Franklin has absorbed it into himself when he fails to mention her. Franklin states that, quote, from a child I was fond of reading, and all the little money that came into my hands was ever laid out in books. Despite being a large family and not wealthy, Franklin's family kept a library. Republican motherhood was reliant on a mother being literate to teach virtues, and also began to promote better education opportunities for women. By having a library at home, Franklin paints that this gave him an advantage in life, that his mother was able to educate him properly and provide readings on virtues needed by Franklin to succeed. Franklin himself even states that having access to these volumes, quote, perhaps gave me a turn of thinking that had an influence on some of the principal future events of my life. Franklin continues to state his moral advantages when he arrives in London. Here, he compares his work ethic to that of the English printers. He states that his desire for water over beer proves to serve him better in the workplace, that, quote, they wondered to see from this in several instances the water American, as they called me, was stronger than themselves who drank strong beer. While a small instance, Franklin states that his behavior had an influence on the other workers, and they themselves soon began to adapt his avoidance of beer during work hours, which increased productivity. He also made improvements to the printing shop laws that improved the work environment. This is exactly the product Republican motherhood wanted to produce for a new nation. Republican motherhood only had so far reach. Women were still restricted to their domestic spheres, and while their teachings and virtuous examples for their sons and husbands were taught at home, once out in the civic sphere, men could relapse. And this is where Franklin himself finds he struggles. Franklin himself struggles with the person he ought to be and seems to try to absorb Republican motherhood, or thus strives to be its perfect model. Throughout this autobiography, these struggles are highlighted by what he calls his, quote, erratas. Franklin then lays the foundation down for a moral perfection in an entire chapter in his autobiography for others to follow. Throughout his life, Franklin made contributions to Philadelphia, such as the Franklin Stove, the American Philosophical Society, and forming post offices and militias and fire stations. For these, he refused patents or extreme praise, instead claiming that these helped the betterment of society and a new nation. As the autobiography unfolds, Franklin's life aligns with the ideals found in Republican motherhood. He seems to lay down what he believes to be the foundation for future generations to become successful and sons of liberty. He has absorbed the ideals of Republican motherhood and almost writes as its first success story, but also as its first mother. Therefore, it is unjust to say Franklin is a, quote, self-made man. Scholar Matthew Garrick instead coins him as a self-made son, who without the help of his mother's rearing and the climate change of a new nation and the ideals of Republican motherhood, Franklin could not have become as successful as he did during his lifetime.